This is what is bringing the Caribbean some of the coldest weather for some spots in years. So I want
Something
to
is wrong, and people feel it before they can explain it. This cold does not feel natural. Jamaica is not supposed to feel like this. Not at night. Not in February. Not with families sleeping under layers they have not touched in years. Not with children coughing through the early hours. Not with elders waking up stiff, aching, and unsettled. Yet here we are, adjusting quietly to something that feels out of place, something that does not belong in the collective memory of this island. And that quiet adjustment is the most disturbing signal of all. Because when something truly abnormal happens, the first danger is not the event itself. The real danger is how fast people accept it as normal. How quickly routines shift. How easily the mind adapts to discomfort when it believes there is no alternative. This cold front did not arrive with panic or warning. There were no emergency broadcasts interrupting daily life. No national address explaining why a tropical island suddenly feels unfamiliar after sunset. No serious attempt to translate what people are feeling into words that make sense. Instead, the change slipped in silently. Doors that once stayed open all night are now shut tight. Fans are turned off. Jackets are pulled from storage. Blankets reappear on beds where they have not been seen in years. Conversations happen in low voices, often late at night, always circling back to the same uneasy question. Has this ever happened before? Officially, the answer is yes. Cold fronts can reach the Caribbean. Weather patterns shift. Climate variability exists. Science provides a language that sounds reassuring, measured, and complete. But here's the problem. That explanation feels thin when placed against what people are actually experiencing in their bodies and homes. This cold does not behave like a passing system. It does not sweep through and move on. It lingers. It spreads across the region. It settles into walls, into joints, into sleep patterns. Nights feel colder than days. The air feels heavier. Breathing feels different. People wake up more tired than they went to bed. And the silence from institutions feels louder than any alarm ever could. Silence creates space. And in that space, uncomfortable questions begin to grow. What if this cold front is not just weather? What if it is timed? What if it is amplified? What if it is simply useful? Those questions sound unsettling, but they do not come from fantasy. They come from pattern recognition. From living through a period where the world has repeatedly shown that power no longer announces itself the way it once did. Around the globe, control no longer arrives with tanks rolling down streets or bombs falling from the sky. It arrives through systems people depend on every day. Energy prices spike. Food costs rise. Trade routes tighten. Movement becomes restricted. Borders close without soldiers. Economies are pressured without formal wars. Supply chains choke without declarations. Pressure is applied quietly, indirectly, and always with plausible deniability. In that context, the idea that environmental stress could become part of the equation no longer sounds extreme. It sounds like an extension of existing tools, a continuation of a logic that prioritizes leverage over confrontation. Weather modification itself is not science fiction. Cloud seeding has existed for decades. Atmospheric experiments are openly discussed in academic and military circles. Climate modeling is now advanced enough to predict not just temperature changes, but human behavior under environmental stress. None of this is hidden information. It is public, documented, and funded. What remains unclear is where research ends and leverage begins. And this is where discomfort turns into unease. When physical conditions disrupt sleep, health, productivity, and movement, pressure is already being applied, whether anyone intended it or not. When people feel weaker, colder, more tired, and less certain, decision-making changes. Patience shortens. Anxiety rises. Dependency on systems increases. This is not about proof. It is about patterns. History leaves a trail that is easy to ignore when viewed in isolation. A financial collapse here, a pandemic there, energy shortages, supply disruptions, migration pressure, extreme weather events appearing outside their historical zones. Each incident can be explained on its own. Each comes with experts, charts, and reassurances. But taken together, they form a rhythm. And rhythms matter more than individual beats. Jamaica sits in a fragile position inside that rhythm. A small island economy, trade-dependent, climate-exposed, energy-constrained, deeply tied to global systems it does not control. That means disruptions that might feel manageable elsewhere can feel suffocating here. Even small changes ripple outward, touching daily life in ways that are hard to escape. Cold is not just discomfort. It is stress layered onto existing vulnerabilities. It strains health systems that already operate close to their limits. It increases energy demand in a country not built for heating. It disrupts agricultural cycles that rely on predictable warmth. It hits the elderly, the sick, and the poor first. It changes how people move, gather, and work. It introduces pressure without a visible enemy. And pressure without an enemy is the most unsettling kind. You cannot argue with it. You cannot vote it out. You cannot protest it directly. You can only adapt. And adaptation, when forced repeatedly, reshapes societies in quiet ways. That is why dismissing public unease as panic misses the point. People are not uneasy because temperatures dropped a few degrees. They're uneasy because the cold feels out of place in a world that already feels unstable. Because it adds one more layer of uncertainty to lives that have already absorbed too many shocks. When reality stops matching expectation, trust begins to erode. Trust in forecasts, trust in institutions, trust in the idea that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. The most dangerous shifts are never announced. They arrive quietly, wrapped in reasonable explanations, while people argue over whether they are even real. By the time certainty arrives, adaptation has already been forced. New habits have formed. New limits have been accepted. That is how normal life changes. So no, this is not a claim that the 2026 cold front was engineered. It is not an accusation. It is not a declaration. It is something more unsettling than that. It is the realization that Jamaica may be entering a phase where old assumptions no longer apply, where climate cannot be taken for granted, where stability becomes conditional, where external systems quietly shape internal life without asking permission. It is the realization that vulnerability is no longer theoretical. It is felt at night, in bedrooms, in coughing fits, in aching joints, in the way people hesitate before opening a window. The real question is not whether this cold was planned. The real question is what happens next if this becomes normal. If cold fronts grow more frequent, if they last longer, if they arrive without warning and leave without explanation, if each event pushes people to adjust just a little more until adjustment becomes a permanent state. Because when abnormal conditions repeat often enough, they stop being questioned. They become the background of life. And that is when real change takes hold. If you want to understand what may actually be unfolding and what it could mean for Jamaica's future, stay with this conversation. It is uncomfortable. It raises questions without easy answers. It forces attention where reassurance would be easier. And that discomfort is exactly why it matters. If this cold front were an isolated event, the discomfort would fade with time. People would complain, joke about the chill, then move on. Memory would soften the edges. Normal life would resume. That is how weather is supposed to work. But what unsettles people now is not just the cold itself. It is the growing sense that this moment does not stand alone. There is a quiet awareness forming that the systems Jamaicans rely on feel thinner than they used to. Less forgiving, less stable, more reactive to forces far beyond the island's control. The cold arrives into that awareness like a final confirmation that something deeper is shifting. Because when conditions change in a way that affects the body first, rational explanations come later, if they come at all. People feel the impact before they understand it. And once trust in predictability breaks, it is hard to restore. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, not because it turns speculative, but because it turns structural. Jamaica has always lived with exposure. Hurricanes, droughts, economic swings, global market shocks. These were familiar risks, understood, and to some extent planned for. The danger now is that exposure is no longer limited to dramatic events. It is creeping into the background of daily life. Cold nights, disrupted sleep, higher electricity use, increased illness, subtle reductions in productivity, quiet strain on households already stretched thin. These are not headline-grabbing disasters. They're slow pressure points. And slow pressure points are often the most effective. When people are tired, they conserve energy. They move less. They engage less. They become more inward-focused. Community interaction changes. Public life softens. Resistance becomes effortful. Even curiosity begins to fade. This is not psychology as theory. It is physiology as reality. Environmental stress shapes behavior, whether anyone intends it to or not. That is why the silence around this cold feels heavier than the temperature itself. Silence signals that adaptation is expected, not discussion. That people should absorb the change rather than question it. That discomfort is something to manage privately. And when institutions remain quiet, individuals fill the gaps with their own interpretations. Some dismiss it, some joke, some worry quietly, some spiral. But nearly everyone senses that this feels different from past cold snaps, even if they cannot articulate why. Part of that unease comes from timing. The world is not calm right now. It is not stable. It is not predictable. Conflicts simmer without resolution. Economies tighten. Debt expands. Energy systems strain. Climate behavior grows more erratic. Migration pressures rise. Trust in leadership declines almost everywhere. In that environment, even natural events feel loaded with meaning. Because people are already primed to expect disruption. And Jamaica's position in the global system makes that expectation sharper. The island does not control fuel prices. It does not control shipping lanes. It does not control currency flows. It does not control climate patterns generated far beyond its borders. Yet it absorbs the consequences of all of them. That imbalance creates a quiet vulnerability, one that does not require malicious intent to be dangerous. This is where the idea of leverage becomes important. Leverage does not require coordination or conspiracy. It emerges naturally when dependencies stack. When a system relies on external inputs for energy, food, medicine, trade, and climate stability, even small disruptions become powerful. Cold increases energy use. Energy costs strain households. Strained households reduce spending. Reduced spending slows the economy. Slower economies stress governments. Governments make compromises. That chain does not need a mastermind. It only needs repetition. And repetition is what people are beginning to fear. If this cold front passes and another follows, if February feels like this again next year, if nights remain unpredictable, if the body never quite relaxes into expectation again, then something fundamental changes. Because climate memory is not abstract. It lives in habits, in architecture, in clothing, in sleep patterns, and how people plan their days. Jamaica is built for warmth. Its homes, its infrastructure, its energy systems assume heat, not cold. When that assumption breaks, adaptation costs rise. Who pays those costs matters. Those with money buy heaters, extra blankets, better insulation. Those without adjust their bodies. They endure. They get sick more often. They miss work. They fall behind quietly. Inequality widens without policy changes, without announcements, without debates. Cold does that. It redistributes stress downward. And stress that redistributes downward tends to reshape societies from the inside out. This is why some people feel uneasy when they hear reassurances that everything is normal. Because normal does not feel like this. Normal does not feel unfamiliar inside one's own home. Normal does not require silent adjustment without explanation. Normal does not linger in the body. The deeper fear is not that someone is controlling the weather. The deeper fear is that no one needs to. That global systems have reached a point where instability generates its own pressure, where feedback loops replace direct action, where disruption no longer needs intention to have effect. In that world, deniability becomes permanent. Every event can be explained as coincidence, as natural variation, as complexity, as unfortunate timing. And each explanation can be technically true while still missing the larger pattern. That pattern is this: life is becoming less predictable in small, cumulative ways. And predictability is the foundation of peace. When people cannot anticipate tomorrow's conditions, they conserve rather than build. They react rather than plan. They survive rather than imagine. Cold nights may seem minor compared to storms or floods, but they touch the most private spaces of life. Sleep, health, rest, recovery. When those are disrupted, everything else weakens. That is why this moment matters. Not because it proves anything, not because it accuses anyone, but because it reveals fragility. It reveals how thin the margin has become between stability and strain, how easily external conditions can alter internal life, how quickly comfort can turn into vigilance, and vigilance sustained long enough changes who people are. The danger is not panic. The danger is normalization. If people begin to accept that discomfort is the new baseline, if they stop asking why conditions feel wrong, if they internalize stress as personal rather than structural, then adaptation completes itself. History shows this pattern clearly. Societies rarely collapse suddenly. They compress, they tighten, they adjust downward. Expectations lower, horizons shrink. By the time people realize what was lost, it feels too distant to reclaim. That is why the question hanging in the air right now is not about temperature. It is about trajectory. Is this an anomaly that will pass and be remembered as strange? Or is it the first signal of a shift that will repeat often enough to redefine normal life? Because if it is the second, then preparation looks different. Preparation is not about fear. It is about awareness, about recognizing that stability can no longer be assumed. That resilience must be built quietly, intentionally, and locally. It means paying attention when the body reacts before the mind understands. It means listening to discomfort rather than dismissing it. It means questioning silence, not with accusation, but with clarity. Jamaica does not need to believe in conspiracies to take this moment seriously. It only needs to recognize vulnerability when it reveals itself. And vulnerability has revealed itself in the cold. The nights will warm again. They always do. But the memory will linger. The question will linger. The sense that something shifted, even slightly, will remain. And once that awareness exists, it cannot be undone. Because the most powerful changes do not announce themselves. They arrive quietly, settle in, and wait for people to decide whether they are paying attention. This is not the end of normal life, but it may be the end of assuming normal is guaranteed. And that distinction makes all the difference.